Christianity has a tremendous need for a psychology like Jung's, and the widespread interest on the part of Christians in his psychology can be taken as a recognition of that fact. But the Jungian-Christian dialogue has been going on for more than 40 years, and something keeps it from flourishing. In this series of profiles, we're going to meet people involved in different facets of this dialogue and try to discover what is happening in it today and what hopes there are for it in the future. Today we are in Lancaster, England, to visit Adrian Cunningham. The relationship between Victor White, the Dominican priest and Thomist philosopher, and C.G. Jung sums up the problems and promises of the Jungian-Christian dialogue. Their warm friendship was to end in estrangement. Tell us how you first met Victor White.
I was spending a lot of time in a Dominican house in London, and around 57-ish, I had a fairly typical male adolescent interest in the occult, and I'd got Jung's Psychology and Alchemy, which had just recently been published, I think, out of the public library. This was getting into a bit of trouble at school. I had one of these books confiscated at lunchtime, and it was suggested that Victor White could either straighten me out or offer some helpful advice. And he offered, as best I recollect, very helpful advice, and suggested I just kept quiet about what I was thinking and went on with it.
What was he like?
He lived for ideas, a humorous person, and had a lot of very good friends, but he, two people have told me that if he really had a philosophical problem, I mean, he could be in his room for 2 or 3 days lying on his bed thinking about it. I mean, he led a very intense philosophical life. He's quite slightly built. Some people refer to him as bird-like. But also he had, I'm rather embarrassed to say, I think I followed him. He used to smoke with a cigarette holder. And so this rather slightly built, friendly person, 40 years older than myself, giving a reasonable amount of time. There were 2 or 3 quite long conversations. But what I still remember is the cigarette holder and the good humour. I was having a series of arguments with some friends, including Dominicans, about various things, including the problem of evil. And I was simultaneously asked to contribute to a collection of magazine articles for another Dominican. And I thought, oh, I'll go back and have a look at the Victor White Jung stuff. And I thought it'd be nice to just put in a few little academic footnotes and new stuff from the correspondence between Victor White and Jung, because they'd known one another for a good 20 years. And the papers couldn't be found. They were all supposed to be in the Dominican house at Cambridge and couldn't be found. And I left it for a bit, and then thought I'd have another shot at it. And what did survive were myriads of sermon notes, which I don't think will ever be read by any other human being, and thousands of photographs. He was a great photographer. But of the famous correspondence, not a trace. And someone remembered that it had last been looked at, if only one person might have looked at it. And that was the person, one of the people doing the Jung selected letters. And by a series of moves and inquiries, I discovered that they weren't with the main Jung papers in the Zurich University Library. And they ought to be in the private archive of the Jung family, if anywhere. And they weren't there, and eventually it was found that a member of the family got interested in this old dispute and had taken them away. But eventually we got them back together. They should never have left Cambridge, of course, but quite how they did is still a bit of a mystery. And they'd apparently, when he was getting towards the end, Jung said to his son, and he wanted Father White's papers kept separately from the other correspondence. Why Jung wanted that, I don't know. He did somewhere say that he had numerous acquaintances and thousands of correspondents, but he only had two real friends he could talk about his own problems to. One was Eric Neumann, who is then in Israel, and the other one was Victor White. So my best guess is that he thought the correspondence was personally important to him. Other people have thought there must be something scandalous or discreditable in it, but there isn't. I think there's been rather more a mystery of what might be in the correspondence than actually is the case. Fascinating and informative as they are. When I was looking for the things in Cambridge, and we'd just discovered these sermon notes and no signs of the letters, there was aged Dominican who had been in the house at the time Victor White died in '61, and he remembered that the stuff was all in a tin trunk, and he proudly told me that it was a jolly useful tin trunk, and he'd used it to take his belongings to Leicester. But he said he was willing to show me the trunk, but he'd taken all Victor's stuff out in order to put his in. Dominicans, like many other religious orders, are not terribly interested in keeping records. So I might somewhere have a photograph of the tin trunk, but there were no letters inside it. Eventually, when the Jung family found them, and I went armed with a large piece of paper rubber stamped by Dominican officials saying that I was the right person to do this sort of stuff, to negotiate what to do with the letters that should have been in Cambridge. Jung's originals were now in Zurich. I went out to the famous Jung house at Kusnacht, and I think everybody knows it's got the plaque above it about Genius Locke or something like that. But I got out of the wrong, there were two stations in Kusnacht, I got out of the wrong one, so the directions were all haywire. And I asked someone where this number was, and they said, the Jung house, opposite the gas station. This is what you don't see on the documentaries. But since Jung, it's a busy road, and since, I don't know when, but there's a very large filling station just opposite this famous front door. So I felt this gave a sort of 1990s or whatever it was touch to this. Otherwise, it looks as if it's in the depths of the countryside. And certainly there's a beautiful lake outside. But it was quite uncanny sitting in Jung's consulting room, talking to his son, who looks remarkably like him. And as we were sitting there, I kept getting this strange sort of time warp, that it was the son I was talking to and not the father. And obviously Jung's side, I mean 90% of it is available in the selected letters. White's side of it I hope to get published with some other material of his, perhaps 2 or 3 years' time. Looking through it, I was struck that White's misgivings about some of Jung's views about the relation between psychology and theology, and especially about the question of evil, were there from 1942, when he gave his first talk on Jungian things, and he'd been reading up and being in a form of analysis the previous 2 years. And so White was very, very quick off the ball about what he saw as limitations in Carl Jung's approach. And they were intensely close. White went to stay on many occasions at the tower at Bollingen, which very, very few people ever were invited to. They talked about dreams. The famous dream of Jung being with his father and being unable to get his head the last millimetre to the floor in the presence of the All-High, which I think most people will know from Memories, Dreams and Reflections. And that he sent to White in 1947. And I think that was possibly the beginning of the Answer to Job book. So that they were very close. Jung was sending White some of his dreams, and White was obviously talking about his. And Jung showed him how to use the I Ching, and they did some other form of divination, of which I'm still trying to decipher what the system was. So the idea that Victor White was a straight-laced, arid intellectual theologian, just mistaken. I mean, not many Catholic priests at that time were going around operating the I Ching and other forms of divination, discussing dreams and so on. So, and there was it was a very close relationship. It was very lively. Jung, in words that dangerously to me replay what Freud said to him, thought of Jung as his bridge to the Catholic world. Sorry, as White as his bridge to the Catholic world. And I think White was the only person of that kind to be asked to join the managing board of the institute when it started. So Jung saw him very much as a bridge or an emissary to the Catholic world. And it also struck me towards the end of it. I mean, there's all kinds of complicated philosophical, theological ins and outs and toings and froings. But towards the end of it, I thought, when they'd fallen out so bitterly, Victor White, one of the very few, possibly the only person in the inner circle, who really stood up to the old man and slogged it out over a period of years until they were both exhausted with it. So in that sense, the relationship was tragic in the last few years. They simply did not meet. I don't want to make everything hinge on the correspondence, because I think historically it's important, and personally it was important to both of them. And that question about how you describe and place evil and the idea of God, I think it's almost an archetypal question in the sense that we'll be arguing about it until the last minute of recorded time. I think there are certain positions there that have been going around for centuries, and I'm no more likely to be able to wrap this up than they were, or perhaps anyone else will. As a record of a sustained attempt to argue a certain psychological position and a certain philosophical, theological one, I think it's a classic. I'm also aware that both phenomena are alive, and we've come 30 years on, and the Catholic world that Victor White was operating in could belong to another century rather than just a few decades back. So much has changed. Also, analytical psychology has changed, and occasionally I have a crazy thought, what would a dialogue between James Hillman and Victor White be like? I mean, in a way you can't do this. You'd have to move everything into the 1990s. One of the points I find quite difficult for myself is that the kinds of material or the kinds of therapists who were operating when Jung was alive seem to have changed quite significantly. Or it may be that the classic analyses and dream accounts are coming out of a process of editing, so that 200 dreams are sort of all just flim-flam, and the one sticks out is the one that gets written up and is classical. But the old-fashioned, crudely put, beam me down Scotty Star Trek idea of archetypes that was certainly held by some of the classical Jungians like Esther Harding. I think the work of the last 10 years has suggested that this was deeply flawed from the outset, and that Jung got a lot of his founding data profoundly wrong or slightly fudged. But there's part of me that is still that 17, 18-year-old person who, in an off moment, still would like to think that the collective unconscious is some sort of quasi-entity popping the stuff up like carrots. That's not a very good metaphor. I, in my own experience, don't find this, and I think increasing numbers of people don't find it either. So how you account for this, I don't know. But the context for a discussion would have to be very, very different, because you've got a different. You've no longer got a classical Jungian thing. You've got 3 or 4 very, very different ones, and you've no longer got a sort of agreed Catholic philosophical framework. You've got half a dozen or more. So I'm afraid I haven't got any specific sort of recommendations about the next stage. There seems to be a degree of either creative disintegration or decomposition going on both sides.